Okay, we had market down ahead of Nvidia earnings on Wednesday. The Dow was down 159 points, down 0.39%. S&P was down almost 34 points, down 0.60%. Nasdaq was down 1.12%, 199 points, rounding up. The Russell was down 0.65. The VIX was up over 10%, 10.89%. Rising to 17, just over 17, 17.11. We had the Nvidia earnings. They beat. Stock has been down. Nvidia was down by 2.10% for the session, and currently over half an hour to earnings, it's currently down 4.15%. It had tanked about 8%. Initially, it tried to pop and then it dropped, and then attempted a recovery, and right now it had rebounded and it was down just about 1%, and then now currently down about 4.15% there. See how it closes out. But again, if we see Nvidia sell off, as I keep saying, again, S&P or Nasdaq could pull back and then go up and fill the gap at a later date ahead of the Fed pivot on September 18th. So again, if we do get a sell-off with Nasdaq, got a bearish momentum signal today. Well, signals taking place, I'll show you that. But down around 4% at the moment for Nvidia. And Nvidia did beat on earnings and revenue both. The guidance going forward is also beating expectations. Now here's the 5-minute chart of Nvidia after hours. Here you can see right when the report hit, there was a bounce 20 minutes after the market closed, and then this big ugly sell-off, dropping about 8% down to that low right there, and then now this attempted rebound. This is the 5-minute chart. So this is what's going on, and again, currently down around 4% or so. See how it closes by tomorrow. Daily time frame, we've had red, awesome oscillator bars on Nvidia. We've come back and we filled the gap at 126. The semiconductors have not filled that same gap, and that was the gap lower. That gap fill on the Nasdaq 100 at 20,398. We've had again this rebound back up to fill the gap at 126, and then we've gone sideways. Now we're selling off at the moment. We'll see what happens. But again, if we do see a sharp sell-off by tomorrow, we could get a bearish momentum shift right here on Nvidia. We did get it today on the Nasdaq in the daily time frame. This is Nvidia. Got it on the semiconductors. The semiconductors, again, we've had the close below the 10 period. Now we get the reversal of conditions here for momentum in the daily time frame for SMH, the semiconductor holding ETF. And again, you've had the red bars here. So again, Nasdaq did the exact same thing. It struggled at the 50 period moving average here. Again, it's not come back up like Nvidia to fill this gap back over here. And this gap took place on the 17th. Remember, the S&P peaked on the 16th and it diverged with the semiconductors. It diverged with Nasdaq at that time, where semiconductors had already peaked, and so did the Nasdaq. Their Nasdaq on the 10th, semiconductors on the 11th of July. So now we get another red bar here. See the little red arrow, the rejection at the 50. So again, if we do get a bigger pullback, I think both semiconductors here and Nasdaq, I think that if they do get a bigger pullback, they'll eventually come back and fill this gap as we move towards the Fed pivot, the Fed cutting rates. But I think the semiconductors have peaked. I think that Nvidia has likely peaked, and also the Nasdaq has peaked. I think the S&P has peaked, but it's not making new highs yet. I told you I've been watching to see if we get a sell-off and then go make new highs, or do we try to do it immediately. So right now, we've got this red going on here with the semiconductors. Nasdaq's doing the exact same thing. Here is the Nasdaq. So we'll be watching to see what happens with Nvidia's close. But ahead of the Nvidia earnings, we saw Nasdaq sell off. It was down 1.18%. It was down 231 points. And we saw the cloud taken out. We saw the red bars continue here. So again, reversal of conditions with momentum. Again, I believe that Nasdaq will eventually go back up and fill this gap, but I don't think it's going to make a new high. As I've said, I believe it peaked over here. I told you to be watching for a reversal back at that time. Below the upper Bollinger Band, not seen on this chart, slamming into major resistance, which I addressed in yesterday's video. And again, I told you the very next day on the 11th, we sold off with the CPI 500 points. I told you I thought we'd rebound back up, get a lower high. But I told you I thought Nasdaq had peaked, and I've been saying that ever since. Still think that. Very few people have the guts to tell you what they think. If this is a 5-leg push lower, I think you can get an A, a B, and then a C and come back up and fill that gap and still get a lower high on Nasdaq. I do think S&P will make a new high. Could see an ABC move under construction with Nasdaq, but by today's close, we did get that. Red bar. We did get momentum officially shifting here on the Nasdaq, with the bars turning red, holding below the 10-period moving average, but now taking out the cloud and getting our second red bar here. S&P did not get it. Had these divergences in the 60-minute time frame. We very well could see the S&P join the Nasdaq. If the signal remains bearish. We did get the first red bar today on the S&P 500 daily chart. Again, you've got this divergence here on the stochastic. You've got the divergences going on in the 60-minute time frame, triple negative divergence, as I've talked about. And again, trying to take out the 10-period moving average. Nasdaq already did it. S&P turned down, and then we turned back up, and we closed pretty much right at that 10-period moving average. If we get more red bars, again, Nasdaq and S&P can both pull back. S&P will likely eventually make a new high and fill this gap up here. We have not done that yet. Nasdaq, if it gets a bigger pullback, still think it will go to that 20,398 area and get a lower high, but it did get a red bar here. Wouldn't be surprised to see a reversal of conditions here, meaning we get a red bar, a red cloud, S&P tomorrow, joining the Nasdaq again, likely building momentum back. If in fact we get it, see how Nvidia closes. Again, it's not over until we get the close tomorrow. We look like an after hours on into the early hours of trading before the market opens up tomorrow, and then we'll be watching the close for Nvidia. We'll be watching to see, does the S&P join the Nasdaq and get a reversal of conditions tomorrow? Do we get another red bar here? But and I do believe it will eventually make a new high. Now, we did see a surge of over 10% on the VIX. It's back above the 50. So again, it's possible we get a bigger sell-off with the market. Again, if we do, I do think S&P will go up and make a new all-time high. If we do get a bigger sell-off right here, right now, and Nasdaq again likely will not. It closed back above the 50. We are seeing a surge of volatility of greater than 10%. That means that the VIX is predicting that in the next two trading sessions, the S&P will either get a bottom or a bounce, go a whole lot lower before that happens, get a bigger sell-off. We could get a bounce and, again, still continue on lower. NASDAQ is going to form an ABC type of a correction, could get a bigger sell-off. See if we get a more mild one on the S&P. Keep your eye on the VIX here. Please support the channel with the link directly below. That allows me to be able to provide you this information. If you like the charts, you like the information, consider supporting the channel. I don't have any sponsors, just a direct relationship with you. Do need you respond in order to make it work. So please let me know you want these videos, you like these videos by supporting the channel today. Just follow the link below. You can go to donate at a secured site. You can donate any amount you want or make it a recurring donation. If you do that, I thank you. But please consider partnering with me today, and I thank you for that. Now, this is Nvidia's daily chart. If we see the momentum line begin to flip tomorrow, the daily time frame with the sell-off, then again, maybe Nasdaq starts a bigger sell-off before going higher, getting a bigger rebound, going back up to the 20,400 area to fill the gap. Watching how Nvidia closes tomorrow. This is the daily chart of Nvidia right here. This is the semiconductors and the semiconductor ETF. Momentum did flip today, so again, that could give Nasdaq a bigger sell-off, as I've been talking about, for a larger ABC move. But we did get the momentum flipping today, getting rejection off the 50-period moving average for the semiconductors, the semiconductor ETF. So again, we'll be watching that. We had that back-to-back bearish engulfing pattern that formed first right here, the bearish engulfing. You can't see it because the bars are still reflecting the trend at the moment there. But I talked about it closing below the upper Bollinger Band, momentum shifted, and then we got another one right there, and sell signals that formed at that time, and giving us this big drop on the semiconductors. Talk about the semiconductors because, again, Nasdaq's really moving in lockstep with the semiconductors and with Nvidia. We're getting momentum shifting, we're getting a red bar, and we're seeing momentum here turn back into the negative region. So risk of a bigger sell-off with momentum shifting semiconductors, and potentially that could officially shift tomorrow with Nvidia. So again, as I've been saying, I think we can get an ABC counter trend rally on Nasdaq. I think we can get a pullback. We end up selling off with the Nvidia earnings here going forward, and then get a bigger rally back up above the highs that were recently made here, the Nasdaq 100. But this is the semiconductors, momentum shifting, not there. Probably going to see that happen on Nvidia tomorrow, but we did get it on the semiconductors today. They sold off for the Wednesday session. Get that reversal of conditions with the cloud. I showed you that earlier. We got the momentum line shifting today on the Nasdaq, and we also had the little red arrow show up again, also marking a momentum shift. This is the Nasdaq daily chart, and as I've told you, Nasdaq, this is a 5-leg push lower. We could see this as an A, come back down and get a B, or even a more shallow retracement. But if we get a deeper one, again, it would fit very nicely with this ABC move that comes back up to fill the gap up here at the 20,398 level. But momentum shifting here as well with the momentum line, and little red arrow is showing momentum is trying to shift. It tried to turn back to bullish here. Back up here, turn to bearish. So again, now we're getting it. It's very possible that we get a sell-off with Nvidia. It gives us this scenario of this ABC type of a structure, because again, as I keep saying, I believe that the Nasdaq has already peaked. I believe the bear market has already started with the Nasdaq. The S&P is not there yet. The S&P likely going to make a new high. So we'll see what happens if we get a deeper pullback here with Nasdaq. Do we get more of a shallow sell-off with the S&P 500? But again, momentum officially shifting today here on Wednesday ahead of the Nvidia earnings, which will likely drag Nasdaq down further if Nvidia continues to have the sell-off by the Thursday close. It is currently in after hours. Now the gray shaded area you see right here, this is telling us that something big is getting ready to happen. But I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these gaps filled, come back down, and then a big move back up, or even move back towards the 200. If we get a bigger sell-off But again, eventually, I think Nasdaq will get a bigger rally back up to higher levels than what we've had over here to fill this gap. But I don't think it's going to exceed this level. I think Nasdaq has already peaked, as I've said, shown you why on the weekly chart, featuring that in my videos many times. If I'm wrong about the Nasdaq having peaked, again, we have a channel line, still go hit. But again, oftentimes the Nasdaq and S&P will diverge at major turning points. They did back up at the July peak. They diverged from one another. Okay, Nasdaq made a lower high right here. S&P made a higher high on the 16th of July. Predicted we would get a rally back up, but then we get a lower high with Nasdaq, and S&P would likely diverge with it. That's exactly what happened. That's why when we got that bar, I told you the S&P was likely peaking that day, and that was correct. I told you eventually we'll likely see a larger divergence between the two, and here, again, I think you're going to get this sell-off and then a rebound back up in an ABC formation on the Nasdaq daily chart. But momentum shifting here today on the Nasdaq in the daily time frame. The momentum line, the arrow, the bars reflecting the trend and reversal of conditions I showed you earlier in the video. So momentum signals are flipping. So I think my scenario has a good shot at playing out. Now, we don't have a momentum shift here, momentum line, or with the reversal of conditions with the cloud that I showed you earlier in the video. With Nasdaq, S&P will probably join the Nasdaq before the weekends, all likelihood. But again, you get a bigger pullback if that is now going to happen on the Nasdaq rather than the S&P 500 getting a bigger pullback. So we'll be watching. Again, S&P is likely going to make a new high very soon, probably ahead of the Fed pivot. We'll see a new high on the S&P 500. I don't think we will on the Nasdaq. And as we form these little divergences on the 60-minute charts, as I've been talking about, you got a little one right here with momentum. So again, if we do see them begin to shift on the S&P 500, we'll likely see a bigger sell-off with Nasdaq, but then rebound to a new high on S&P while we get a gap fill and lower high on Nasdaq around that 20,400 area. So again, going to be watching to see, does Nvidia now give us a bigger pullback? Nvidia, the catalyst that leads us back down. Now, remember, Nvidia is not making new highs. Nasdaq already did. That divergence between the two could be very problematic for both of them going forward. Again, other bearish signals on Nasdaq, not quite yet on the S&P. We'll be watching again. The gray shaded area is telling us something big is getting ready to happen, like over here, and we got the drop. Now, again, S&P is probably going to go make a new high. Even if it pulls back, it's probably still going to go make a new high to fill the gap back over here on the gap lower on the 17th. It diverged. When it diverged from Nasdaq, it made a higher high a few days after. Nasdaq peaked on July 10th. Nasdaq made a lower high a few days later. There are no topping signals here yet, so it's likely that this is not a top. Even if momentum shifts, it's likely we're going to see new highs on the S&P 500. Now, over the weekend, I told you to be watching for a triple negative divergence to form on the S&P 500 60-minute chart. I told you to watch to see if that will form a negative divergence here on the 4-hour time frame. That's now taken place, and now we're seeing momentum shift today. This is marking a possible short-term top right here. We have a negative divergence in the 4-hour time frame with momentum. We have a triple negative divergence on the 60-minute chart, things like the RSI. So again, wouldn't be surprised to see Nvidia give the Nasdaq and the S&P a pullback The S&P goes and makes new highs. Nasdaq ends up getting another leg up after a pullback and gets a lower high, urging a larger divergence with the S&P 500. The 4-hour time frame forming these divergences here on the S&P 500, which is giving us today's volatility and likely to continue if we get an Nvidia down day tomorrow after earnings here. So we'll be watching to see how that unfolds. This is the 4-hour chart of the S&P 500, and I've been talking about a divergence forming here. It has now done so, so I wanted to show you that. I talked about the 60-minute charts in great length and detail in my last couple of updates. I wanted to show you this 4-hour chart and the daily charts here. With momentum flipping in the 4-hour time frame, S&P will likely see that happen. Nasdaq's got momentum already flipped in the daily time frame. The S&P will likely follow suit. So again, we'll see how big the sell-off is. Again, we do have a possible 1, 2, 3. Maybe this is 4, and then we go on and get 5. Once this move is done, this is a 5-leg push higher. It can't overlap with this peak right here, so we'll be watching to see how it unfolds. But again, we could see a bigger sell-off with the Nasdaq rather than the S&P, but momentum shifting here could spill over into the daily time frame with the momentum line shifting. We'll see if more signals turn right here. This peak over here, we got topping signals, and we saw the cloud shift. Tried to get some bullish signals on it here, but they failed to be confirmed. The cloud held as bearish up until right there. The momentum tried to turn back to bullish and short-term bullish signals here with momentum, but it flipped right back to bearish, and we had that 3-day sell-off of 8%, the S&P 500. So again, I'll be watching these other signals, the cloud reflecting the trend. We'll see if these begin to spill over, if we get a bigger sell-off, spill over into the daily time frame and see momentum start shifting there. Nasdaq 4-hour chart, again, we're getting some short-term topping signals for momentum here, and then again the momentum line had already turned. We saw that happen with the S&P 500. They diverged also, Nasdaq making a lower high, S&P making a higher high. That's exactly what we had back up at the peak on July 10th. Nasdaq peak on July 10th, it turned down. The New York, we'll see if Nasdaq, and I had some technical problems, so I might have had to shut off the video here for a second there. But again, if we can get a bigger sell-off, I think that you can see something like this, where we go back up and end up filling the gap, but making a lower high in all likelihood on Nasdaq. So we've had momentum shift in the 4-hour time frame and on the 60-minute chart. Nasdaq, now we're seeing it in the daily time frame. We're seeing momentum shift. See if the S&P joins it daily time frame, but momentum did shift today on the S&P 4-hour chart, as we saw, and we've had it bearish with the triple negative divergence on the daily. On the 60-minute chart for Nasdaq. Pardon me, S&P 500. Celebrating my wedding anniversary, traveling a little bit and dealing with a time change, making the video in the wee hours of the morning. So I do apologize for misspeaking on certain things. I'm a little bit tired. But again, we had sell signals over here. And again, the cloud flipped, the cloud stayed bearish, tried to turn back to bullish here. This bullish signal was never confirmed. Got bullish signals here in the 4-hour time frame. Again, these signals were confirmed, and cloud flipped right there. And again, here we are. So again, I'm going to be watching. Do we start seeing red, the red background, the red ribbon? Start seeing some of these signals turn bearish here. If we take these levels out, a larger ABC move on the Nasdaq. That's what I'm going to be looking for. And again, this is the Nasdaq 4-hour chart. Now S&P got that divergence. Nasdaq did not. It is making a lower high, so you have a short-term divergence between the two. We'll see if Nvidia gives us a bigger sell-off. We'll be watching the close for Nvidia tomorrow, and to see what happens with the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq right here. As I'm continuing to make the video, Nvidia is selling off more. Again, initially we had a bounce, and then it sold off 8%, attempted a recovery, recouped all of the losses except for about 1%. Started selling off more, about 4 and 5%. Now it's down 8.34% in after hours. Again, we'll be looking to see what happens at the open tomorrow. Do we get a gap lower? Do we get a pullback or reversal starting in the market? And again, possibly an ABC move on the Nasdaq. Now look, I talked about these 60-minute charts over the weekend. I told you, again, S&P can get a divergence and diverge with Nasdaq. It can get a lower high. But I told you, if we get a triple divergence here on the 60-minute chart, we could get a bearish divergence in the 4-hour time frame. That did play out here on the RSI. Showed you we got a bearish divergence in the 4-hour time frame with momentum. We've now lost the momentum line here and the momentum cloud, and we broke this other trend line right here. So we'll be watching to see, does the S&P end up getting a bigger pullback or a sell-off or reversal? And we not only had the divergence here on the RSI, but down here on the MACD as well. We had this divergence and then this larger divergence. Get a bigger sell-off right now. The MACD will remain in a negative territory and turn down and go deeper. If we again, I did tell you the S&P is back testing with the log scaling, the breakdown of the trend line. So just keep in mind, as we have that negative divergence on the 60-minute chart, you're back testing this trend line, and again, we're getting a pullback here. The divergence played out with momentum. We got another reference point right here, and again, taking us below the 50, below the momentum line. Going to end up getting a bigger drop. Then we'll be watching our 200 period moving average here on the 60-minute chart. Now the Dow has the same negative divergence here on the 60-minute chart as the S&P. So again, we'll be watching to see what happens. Tomorrow's close with Nvidia earnings. Now again, S&P has a 5-leg push higher that it could, again, still be under construction where we get some kind of sell-off, but then go back and make a new high. The red dotted line is, this red dotted line right here is the high at 56.70, which was the all-time high for the S&P 500. Late wave is speculation. Here you can see it with the gaps, and I talked about, would this gap up here fill first, or do we come back down and test the 200, and maybe try to go to gap support or gap resistance here with this first gap lower? Gap is going to be tested first, the one up here or the one down here. I marked all these gaps, and again, you have 4 of them. If we get a bigger sell-off with S&P 500, then I'll be watching, see, do we go to gap support? Do we try to fill this gap? Do we go to the 200 and then rebound back up? We'll be watching to see what becomes of this move with this divergence right here on the S&P 500. You have it on the MACD and the RSI here on the 60-minute chart. Like I said, eventually I do think we will reach new highs. Whether we get a pullback first, we'll see. We'll see how we close with the Nvidia earnings tomorrow and how that impacts the market. We had that little bull flag I talked about yesterday. We failed at the 50 period. We ended up selling off further with the session today. And again, we're moving here to gap support. You've got the gap fill below at 19,018. Then some other gaps come into play down over here. Did see the triple negative divergences form on the S&P. Those triple divergences on the S&P eventually diverged here with Nasdaq. So again, going to be watching to see if we get a bigger sell-off. But again, could be if this is a 5-leg push lower, that again we have an A, B, C type of a move that's under construction that eventually comes back, fills the gap here, but then that's it in an overall topping process. And I showed you momentum had turned with the Nasdaq already. We didn't have that yesterday with the S&P 500, but we did have it with Nasdaq yesterday. And again, now we're taking out the 10-period moving average. We had tried to push below it, and then we ended up closing back above it, trying to bounce off the 50. Now we're closing below the 50, closing below the 10. So again, the possibility that we have a very large counter trend where we go this A and then get a B, or something even deeper, a B, and then go on and get a C to come back up here and fill the gap at 20,398, and then that's it. The market starts ushering in much bigger sell-off as we move closer to recession. And again, Fed's going to pivot because recession is coming. The stock market is in a topping process and eventually get a bigger sell-off because a recession is coming. But with today's sell-off, again, S&P closed there right at that 10-period moving average, just a fraction below it, but we're seeing momentum turn back down. So can we get a bigger sell-off right here surrounding the Nvidia earnings? We'll be watching that. And like I said, eventually I think the S&P will make a new all-time high. Then I'll be watching, again, do we just get a mild pullback or something deeper? But I do think we will eventually get a new close to an all-time high in an overall topping process. And I believe that we're going to see the top going into the FOMC meeting in September. That again, you're either going to get a top on the S&P ahead of that meeting, or with that meeting, or shortly thereafter in all likelihood.